Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to the University of Vienna for inviting me to give a paper talk. I apologize if what I say is not entirely clear, or maybe it's a bit too dense and compact. Anyway, yeah, it's a theoretical talk, but the talk is grounded on two kinds of experiences that we've had in the Garrett Hermès Foundation. So the first one is this. We were working with the United Nations Alliance of Civilization and with various other people in relationship to the nature of religious education. This has been a kind of important topic for our foundation because we've also been working with a potential museum of religions in Birmingham in the UK. So in a sense, the way that we've been thinking about religious education, or the questions that we've been posing ourselves, have been framed by a dilemma, which is, as well, this. On the one side, as well, how can we have within a secular society, or an increasingly secular society, religious education that's not just based upon one faith or one tradition? But on the other hand, how can we avoid falling into the other extreme of just treating religious traditions from an external sociological point of view, whereas one's just simply conveying facts about religion, which of course is interesting, but as well, how can we help young people? How can an educational curriculum be in religion be designed in such a way that it helps young people to, as well, connect to what's really important about the different religious traditions? And so actually we kind of framed that as how can one develop, as well, a framework for understanding spirituality, which as well would fit for many different religions, so that as well this could be a way of trying to help students experience as well what religion's really about for themselves. Okay, so that was the first set of conversations that is important for this paper. Then the second kind of experience was important for what I'm going to be talking about, is the in the GHFP we have been working with post-conflict dialogue. So on many occasions, that post-conflict dialogue has led us to be in places where we've constructed dialogical processes for people who were formerly enemies, or who were formerly, as well, on different sides of conflict. And the experience that we've had, fortunately, I think, has been really powerful, because we've seen that when the space is set up well, people really change. When somebody opens their heart and talks about the suffering that they've endured, or talks about the effects of a conflict upon them, that touches everybody. And soon the atmosphere, the culture, the ambiance in the room is really intimate and deep, and people are in a different space. They're in just a different space. So the idea was that, as what's part of what's happening when we have that kind of deep post-conflict dialogical conversation, is that when people touch each other, it changes the way they perceive themselves. And so that's kind of what I want to kind of explore, that aspect of peacefulness in its relationship to the thing that I mentioned at the beginning, which is, as well, a framework for understanding for understanding spirituality within different religious traditions. So the paper consists really in building a bridge which goes from the one to the other. And the idea of the bridge is very simple, really. It's kind of like one aspect of spirituality that's relevant to peace education is that as well, the spiritual changes how one identifies oneself, and that dialogues can shift that so that as well, the identification is something which as well is more peaceful. So that's where I'm going really with it all. So I've divided the paper into 4 bits. So the first bit is a conversation about the nature of peace. So I think it's important to recognize that when we understand peace, we shouldn't be really just understanding it as a feeling and nor as a lack of conflict. Conflict's going to always exist. So peace really, I think, should be understood as a state. And whether that's an individual state, an inner state, or a social state, or a community state, it's a state which generates, as it were, a set of peaceful feelings, but it's also a state that generates, it's a state in such that the violent implications of conflict are muted. So in other words, the conflicts will still exist, but they don't have violent implications anymore. So I wanted to characterize positive peacefulness first. Now, secondly, the second section then is to do with self-identification. So, I mean, I think particularly in current society, the word identity is used in so many different ways. It's kind of a little bit confusing and difficult, and I'm trying to carve out a special use of the term. So the first thing is that probably the word identity as a noun is too substance-like, it's too rigid. I think probably, you know, when we talk about identity of something in a strict sense, really we're just talking about the conditions for which that thing, under which that thing still exists. So if I lose my identity, that's equivalent to dying. So when we want to talk about identity within a spiritual sense, we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about how people identify and use the noun, use the verb rather than the noun. So that was the first point about identity, the word identity. The second thing that I wanted to say about identity to help us on this preliminary comment was, of course, in society, we talk about social identity, which is very much to do with the way other people identify one, how other people perceive one, how people identify one. And so usually the reflection of that for the individual is like how I want to be identified, how would I like to be identified? And I'd like to make it clear that I'm not going to be using the word in that sense. So the sense of the word that I'm sort of trying to explicate or get into, I think comes quite close to the Stoic word, oikoisis, which basically means that something's intimately mine. So the opposite of that word would be something like a feeling of separation. This is not me, this is not mine. And I think I'm going to talk about different facets of what that self-identification is. So first of all, it's clear that we identify ourselves in different ways, in different contexts. So it's something that changes. It's not a permanent thing. Secondly, we need to recognize that we self-identify in not just in macro ways, like as a British person or as a male or so on and so forth, but rather we can identify ourselves in micro ways. That is, when I'm really absorbed by a task, I can identify with that goal, identify myself with that goal. Or if I'm facing a particularly strong anger, then I might be identifying myself with that anger. So the second point was that we have micro level self-identifications. And I think the third point would be that this process of self-identification isn't something that's necessarily conscious. It's not something that's deliberate and about which one is self-conscious. In other words, one needs to be able to reflect deeply to understand, that's how I was identifying myself in this context. That's why things went the way they did. So that last point leads us to the idea that, fourthly, we can learn to change the way we self-identify in different situations. That's something that we can shift. Obviously, it's not something one can just tell oneself to do. It's something which is a bit more like planting plants, where one nourishes a certain form of self-identification, and then that produces the fruit. Okay, so those were some preliminary points about self-identification. The main idea about self-identification that I want to present to you is that self-identification can be derivative or more basic. So a derivative self-identification would be something like this. If I identify myself as a person or as a human because I identify myself as a European, and I realize that all Europeans are humans, then I'm identifying myself indirectly as a person or a human. So then my self-identification is derivative. It's not basic. So it's really the idea that we want to talk about when we try to define a spiritual state, I think, should be in terms of non-derivative or basic self-identifications. All right, so that was the second part of the talk. The second part of the talk was the nature of self-identification. So the third part now is going to be about what it is for self-identification to be spiritual. So the question I think that we need to ask is, self-identification is like an act that one performs. So we need to ask as well, what's really the nature of the self that's doing the identifying? And so I'm going to basically argue that in order for a self-identification to be spiritual, these identification has to be aligned with the nature of the self that's doing the identification. And of course, different religious traditions will answer that question, what is the nature of the self that's doing the identifying, in quite different ways. But that's okay, because as we'll see, they have perhaps some things in common which pertain to the nature of peacefulness. So I'm taking that a self-identification would be spiritual in the sense that what I think spirituality means in this context, again, this is a vague definition, but I think it has to be open-textured, is an appropriate connection to the divine or the transcendent or the sacred. And appropriate connection then has to be something that has ethical implications for the person. So we can already, the question is then, what is a spiritual self-identification? We've got general framework for that, but that depends upon the nature of the self that's doing the identifying. So I'm going to give three answers which I think are kind of similar, but they're not quite the same, and they're secular answers. So they're humanist answers. So the three answers are, well, being an I. The second one would be being a person. The third one would be being a human being. But clearly we can see that, that those three answers already contain some profundity and also some direct relevance for peacefulness. Now, if we go into deeper answers, which are non-secular, then that's going to vary between different religious traditions. So, so it's going to be, as we're a transformation of the self will be a transformation of self-identification, in the sense, this kind of thing. I thought of myself as a member of this community. I thought of myself as a person who works in this profession. But now, after this experience, this transformative experience, I see myself as a soul, or as part of God's creation, or as emptiness, or as an expression of the spirit, the universal life force or something. So each tradition will answer it differently, and each one will have its own metaphysics and scriptural basis, traditional basis, but the idea will have to be something similar, which is that kind of spiritual progress will be a part of realizing oneself, becoming closer to what the real nature of the self is. Okay. All right, so we've talked about what a spiritual, we've talked about what peace is, what self-identification is, and now what spiritual self-identification is. So now I want to, as well, show why I think this is really important for understanding peace education and the nature of peace, the nature of positive peace in particular. Well, there's three kind of ideas here. The first one is this. Clearly, the way in which one non-derivatively self-identifies is going to define what one sees as other. So if I identify myself as non-derivatively, as a person, then I'm going to see all persons included in my basic we or us. So in other words, my us-them divide will not be created, will include all persons on the us side. If I see myself as a human, then that means that the non-humans will be on the other, on the them side. So spiritual self-identifications are inclusive, and by being inclusive, they embrace more, a wider we, a wider us. They're more peaceful, they're inherently peaceful. Secondly, insofar as I identify myself non-derivatively as a person, then I'm not self-identifying myself with the contingent source of inner psychological conflicts. In other words, if I'm identifying myself as a person, I'm not identifying myself with these desires, and therefore, as well, those desires are separate from me. Even if they're part of my character, they're separate from what I actually am. And so that's removing the potential violent, psychologically violent aspect of those conflicts. So that's peaceful. The third way in which I think self-identification as a spiritual process or act is important for peace is that when one identifies oneself non-derivatively as a person, then in a sense one's self-identifying with something that has basic value. What I mean by that is we live in a world where there are material things, social institutions, material things such as nappies and cribs and bottles for babies and cups and everything. But those things have only value in relationship to human desires, or the desires of other conscious beings. So they're only valuable in relationship to our desires. But our desires and goals are only valuable insofar as they're actually part of ourselves. So in that sense, as well, what has ultimate non-derivative value is being a person, being a being for whom things can have value. So that means that, as were, the process of connecting to oneself as the nature of oneself as a person is one which is one of rediscovering the wellsprings of value. Okay, so that's more or less the talk, just to conclude. So what I've tried to do is to link the nature of religious education to the nature of post-conflict dialogues. And I think really the thing that's kind of important there, the bridge, is the nature of spirituality. And I've tried to define that in terms of self-identification, some kind of self-identification. And I want to come back to where I started, which is the idea that, as well, that kind of self-identification most easily shifts in dialogical processes which are of the heart and open with other people who normally one would see as other. Thank you very much.